Welcome back, everyone. So this is going to be the second of our three-part series where I answer a common question that I get on Instagram and sometimes here on YouTube, and that is, what is the power setting of the light that I'm using? Now, in video one, I went over why that is really unreliable information when it comes to getting a correct exposure on set. So in this video today, I'm going to go over how to nail your exposure, and I'm going to help you learn how to evaluate it through trial and error, using a gray card, and a light meter. So before we get started, there is one thing that we need to go over. I use Elinchrom lights, and in the Elinchrom system, when I fire my trigger, what happens is that it sends a signal to the lights to fire. In some brands, your trigger will send a signal to your lights to not only fire, but to change the power settings of those lights to match the settings in the trigger. I hear that you can turn this off in Godox, for instance, by switching it to slave mode. So you might want to do that if it helps you in your workflow. Just know that when I fire my lights today, it's just sending a signal to fire, and I will be adjusting the lights, perhaps manually, but probably on my light meter. I could be using a second trigger for my camera. I could be using the trigger that I have on my camera. I'm just using the light meter to turn the light down because it's a quick way to do it. I could also just stand up and turn the light down if I wanted to. In order to teach you exposure, I'm going to be sitting in as the model today, and so I will go over how to dial in your exposure. I'm also going to be showing you how to dial in 3 different lights today: the main light, a fill light, and a hair light. And this is what is known as 3-point lighting. So we'll be talking about how the relationship changes between the 3 lights. Let's start off by firing our main light only. We're just going to use trial and error and evaluate how to get a correct exposure. So I'm using Capture One. You can use Lightroom for this. There are subtle differences. I'll talk about that when it becomes important. But let's go ahead and take a photo here. Oh, but there is one thing. I'm going to be shooting at f8 today because that's a common f-stop that I use for headshots. If you're interested in learning which camera settings to use when, I'm going to be going over that in part 3 so that I can teach you how to photograph with artistic intent. And I have the light set to a very random setting. I think it's at maximum power, and you can see how terrible that looks, or how horribly overexposed it is. So I've got my Sekonic 858 light meter. This one has a transmitter in the back for the Elinchrom system, which means that it can adjust the lights directly from the light meter by using some plus or minus buttons at the bottom. I've got my main light here in group 1, and I'm just going to adjust the power of the light by turning it down using the minus buttons here at the bottom of the controller. And as far as I can tell, I've turned my lights down a total of 4 stops. Know that they make this light meter with a transmitter in it for Broncolor, Godox, Photix, Elinchrom. I'll put the information on screen. If you don't have one of these brands and you think that the price point of these meters in particular, the 478 or the 858, is too high, you can actually get the L308B, which is a meter that will just tell you how bright your flash is when it fires. Just know that our light meter doesn't tell us how to set up our camera in the studio. It tells us what our lights are presently, how bright they are, and it allows us to then adjust the brightness of our lights so that we get the exposure that we want to use. So I want to use f8, so I'm going to adjust the lights so that I get an exposure of f8 at ISO 100. Also, the shutter speed doesn't matter because without flash there would be no picture, and I'm just using my camera at its standard sync speed, which is 1/200th of a second. But we'll be going into exposure settings more in part 3. I just want to set that as a baseline. And just so you know, I'm only using this light up here, which is an Elinchrom 100 centimeter deep octabox. It's also 39 inches in the imperial scale. I'm going to go ahead and increase the power of my light about 1 stop. I'm just going to turn it up. Actually, I turned it up 2 stops, and we'll try again. I think that looks pretty good, but maybe we could have done a little bit better with our exposure, and a good way to test that is to use a gray card. So this is my color checker passport, And it has some color swatches on one side that will allow you to set up a custom profile for your camera. It also has a gray and white card in the other part, and we're just going to be using the gray card today. So I'm going to take a photo here with the gray card near my face. We need to have it where the light is falling. Because we're going to use this to measure the volume of light hitting my face. So it needs to be right here. It can't be here because that will be significantly brighter because it's a lot closer to the light. So I'm going to bring it back here next to my face. We'll take another test picture. Okay, I'm going to come over here to the Adjustments tab, and I'm just going to press H to make sure that I have the hand tool. It doesn't really matter. I just don't want to be using the eyedropper right now. And I'm going to come over here and hover over the gray card. So what I'm looking for right now is I want to know how bright this gray card or middle gray is here on a 255 scale. So you'll notice right here at the top above my head that there are 4 numbers, and there's red, green, and blue, and then you'll see the grayscale number. So that grayscale number is from 1 to 255, with 1 being pure black and 255 being pure white. So we want middle gray to come in at around 125, maybe 130, give or take, plus or minus 10. In Lightroom, you're just going to look at it on the histogram, and you want this number to come in like right up the middle. So what this tells me right now is I'm going to hover the hand tool over the gray card, and it says that right now my gray card is 158. So that tells me that my picture is a little overexposed, but it doesn't look overexposed on the screen. And this sort of illustrates another problem, is when we evaluate our exposure on the camera screen or on the computer screen, we don't know if it's at the right brightness. And if I turn my brightness up on the computer screen all the way up right now, well, then I can see very plainly that my skin is actually overexposed. So maybe I should have had it up brighter. But this is a good reason as to why we would use some metrics like a gray card or later a light meter to measure our exposure rather than just eyeballing it, because there are a number of factors that can lead us down a road where we get the wrong exposure. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to grab the light meter again, and I'm going to turn the power down. Okay, I'm going to turn down the light one stop, and then we'll take another test picture. So I got to go back over to the tether tab, and I'll just sit here and smile. Okay, it looks like I turned it down too far, because now I'm coming in at 98. I'm going to turn it up half a stop. We'll take a photo. All right, I'm at 117. That's not quite bright enough. I'm going to come up another half stop. And I'll evaluate again. And now it's 137. So for me, I think this actually means that we're at a good exposure. We got to 137, remember, somewhere between 120 and 140. That's what I would guess. That's probably about right. Technically speaking, this should be at 127.5 to be correctly exposed. But if it's a little over or a little under, it's fine. So now, what if I were to instead use my light meter? This light meter is set to group 1. Just know that I've got this light in group 1, this one in group 2, and this hair light up here in group 4. And if I were using a kicker, I would have it in group 3. I always keep my lights in the same groups so I know which one I'm adjusting at which time. So I'm just going to start off by randomly turning up the power of this light. Again, I'm in group 1. I'm going to come down here to the plus or minus buttons at the bottom, and I'm just going to press them a bunch of times so that we end up with the light set way too high, and then we'll dial in the exposure. Okay, now the other thing I need to go over is that when I press this button on the side, it's going to tell the light to fire, and it's going to measure how bright the light is. Okay, so it measures at f16 and 8/10. 8/10 of a stop. So our lights normally change in 1/10 stop increments. So f16 and 8/10 is like f20 on your camera. Just know that these use a slightly different scale than your camera would use. The reason why it's good for these usually to use tenths of a stop is that you can adjust the light in tenths of a stop, whereas we usually adjust our camera in third stops. So it's just more accurate this way. So I know that if I want to go down to f8, that I've got to turn it down First, I've got to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So that should get me to F16. And then I need to go down 2 more stops. So that's, I think, right? So I'm going to go 16, would go to 11, and then 8. So I need to go down 2 more stops. So I'm going to press the button. And sometimes I will press the button faster than it can communicate with the light. So I kind of just got to go a little slow here. And I'm looking for 2.8 because that's how many stops it was too bright by 2.8 stops. If all of this is a little foreign to you, you might want to check out a video that I have about the exposure triangle, and I'll link to that video. So I just measured it. It's F8 and 1/3 stop. I'm going to turn it down. 1, 2, 3. And so it should measure now at F8. And it's 5, 6, and 9/10, close enough. I'll take a picture. And you can see that compared to the gray card photo, they are reasonably the same brightness. So I think this is fine. We can go ahead and move on to adjusting our other lights. Now let's talk about our fill light and our hair light. When I'm lighting in the studio, normally I have my accent lights, if you will, the lights that aren't the main light, 2 stops down from the main light. What that means is I want this light to be 1/4 as bright as that light. So the reason why is I just want to subtly fill in some details here and not have it scream to the viewer that there's a light down here. On a person like me with a beard, what normally happens is that there is a shadow under the beard on the neck, and it's black, and the beard is black, and it all blends together. So I want to get a little detail in here to separate the neck from the beard a little bit more. On a younger person, we might just do this in order to preserve details. On an older person, we're going to put a fill light opposite of our main light from below. We're going to have a fill light in order to fill in those shadows in order to reduce wrinkles. That's another reason why we would use a fill light. So when you have wrinkles that are recorded by the camera on someone's face, what's happening is that we have a light from above that's creating a highlight on the top side of the wrinkle, and then we're having a shadow underneath, and that's giving depth. If we add light from below, or it's behind the camera, then we will be filling in those shadows and removing the depth that's recorded by the camera. Normally what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my light meter in order to evaluate, in order to just dial in this light so that if this measures at 4, if this measures at 8, this is going to measure at 4. And that's the reason why I'm going to do that. If I use trial and error, I would just take a test shot and make sure that it looks like it's kind of dimly lit. It doesn't look close to correctly exposed. It doesn't look like I'm holding a flashlight under my face. And then I'm going to fire both lights together and see if it works. If you wanted to, you could use the gray card method. It's going to be very cumbersome. So let's go ahead. I'll switch the camera now over to group 2. We can take a test photo and see how it looks. I want to get a scientific comparison here for you. So I'm actually going to shoot a series of photos and then show them to you so you can see what it looks like where it meters at 2.8, 4, 5.6, and 8. And I'm going to use the light meter each time to evaluate the exposures. Now you can see on screen what it looks like when the fill is 2.8 on the top left, 4 on the top right, 5, 6 on the bottom left, and F8 on the bottom right. All right, so the first thing you'll notice right away is that photo on the bottom right is way overexposed, and that's because both lights are metering at F8, which means they combine to be F11. So when they're really close, you're going to have to adjust your overall exposure. However, you can sort of look here and just see that the wrinkle under my eye is less, those smile lines are less here on the bottom left, and so maybe from a wrinkle perspective, maybe it looks better if we go with having the light meter at 5.6 in the bottom left or F4 on the top right compared to the top left, but this could just be my own insecurity speaking. And maybe we don't want the neck to be so bright as it is on the bottom left. But these are sort of the evaluations that you would make to sort of see like, hey, how do you feel about this? What are you thinking? How does it look to you? I think now that we see all these together, I'm actually going to go with the light on the top right here. And that's where that fill measured at F4. And remember, I was saying that F4 is usually my sweet spot anyway. So I need to measure this light so that it measures at f4. I'm going to turn it down 2 stops. And I'll go ahead and measure it again. Okay, so it measures at f4. We'll take a picture here just to be sure that we've got it dialed in correctly. Okay, that looks exactly right. Now I'm going to turn on the hair light and we'll get that dialed in as well. I'm going to avoid the trial and error. I'm going to avoid the gray card setup. Just know that we could use the same exact methodology on that. I'm just going to use the light meter this time, so it'll be a lot quicker. Okay, so I'm going to go over to group 4 because that light's in group 4, and we're just going to measure group 4. So right now it's at 2.0 and 4/10. I'm going to turn it up 1.6 in order to get to f4. Okay, so we're there now. I'm going to take a photo with all the lights and just see how it looks. And now I'll just show you a comparison with only the 2 lights in the front and then adding the hair light from the back. So the main thing that I noticed right away is that you can see clear separation between my hair and the background, or clear separation on top. My hair is lighter. I actually think it's too dim. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to shoot a series of photos at 8, 5, 6, 4, and 2.8, where I fire that light alone, and we can sort of evaluate how I feel about it, whether or not I think it's too bright or too dim. Hopefully you can see right away that the one on the top left metering at f8 is way too bright. You can see my face is lit up a little bit. That's because it's bouncing off of the soft boxes in front of me. You can see the top right, that one looks about right to me, and that would be metering at 5.6. And on the bottom left, which is where we had it before, metering at f4, it looks too dim. And on the bottom right, it looks way too dim. I'm going to dial it in at this value so that it meters at 5.6. I've got to turn it up 2 stops. Great. Now I'm going to switch the trigger over to fire all of the lights, and we'll look at that photo and we'll compare it to the f4 image, or the image where the hair light metered at f4. Okay, now to me, having the hair light at that value that we see here on the bottom looks a lot better to me. We're actually getting some separation, and I think it looks pretty good. So I think now we could say that our photo is correctly exposed. Well, there is one little thing. I actually think that this light is a little too close to me. That's why my forehead is a little too bright. I'm just going to lean back slightly, and we'll take another photo. And that light looks a lot more even, top to bottom, so I think we've got things dialed in. Now, when it comes to dialing in your exposure, you want to make sure that you're not clipping the whites or the blacks. And what I mean by that is that if you overexpose the whites, your histogram will touch the right-hand side, and it won't have in your image won't have any details in the whites. If you underexpose your image severely, the left-hand side of the histogram will touch the left-hand side, and you won't have any detail in the blacks. So you want to make sure that when you're exposing your photo that you don't underexpose the blacks or overexpose the whites, because if you do so, you're not going to be able to recover them in post. And I would try to get your midtones near the middle. That's what I would aim for. If you're augmenting natural light with flash and you've got the sun coming in as a hair light or a kicker, and the light from the sun is overexposed, then you're going to have to adjust your camera settings in order to make sure that those whites aren't clipped. If you are just using flash for all the lights, but those highlights are clipped, then you're going to have to turn down the hair light or the kicker so that those whites have details. If your blacks don't have details, then you're probably going to have to, but your midtones are correctly exposed, then you're probably going to have to add some fill or add a little more fill in order to bring those black tones up a little higher. Now, there are 2 camps when it comes to histograms. There's the exposed to the right crowd and the exposed to the left crowd. The exposed to the right crowd say that you should overexpose your photo slightly without clipping the whites so that you can preserve details in the dark tones and reduce noise. And then when you bring the file down in post in brightness, you'll have all that detail there. The exposed to the left crowd say that you should underexpose your whites by about 2 stops, and this will somehow preserve detail in the highlights. This doesn't exactly make sense to me. And the reason why is if you don't clip your highlights in the first place, then the detail is going to be there. It doesn't matter if you're 0.2 stops underexposed or 2 stops underexposed. But if you are 2 stops underexposed, then what's going to happen is that you're going to have to boost your midtones in post. And according to the exposed to the right crowd, when you do that, that's going to cause noise. Now, I'm not sure that we really need to worry about noise so much as portrait photographers because most of the time our ISO won't be that high, and with modern cameras, noise isn't that big of a deal. But this is why I would make sure that when you expose your photos that you don't clip the blacks and you don't clip the whites, and you make sure that your midtones are pretty much in the middle or close to it. That's what I'm going for. I hope this all helped and made sense. Remember, in part 3, we're going to go over camera settings, so make sure that you check out that video. If you want to take your learning to the next level, consider joining my online members-only learning platform, the Academy with John Gress, or attending an in-person workshop. Remember to like, subscribe, and sign up for the bell. If you have any questions or comments, please leave those below. Also, I will link to all the gear that I'm using in the description. I hope that you have a wonderful day, and I will talk to you soon.